Okay. Uh, Dr. Craig Burnett is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Hofstra University, and he's going to be our speaker for tonight. He received both his MA and PhD from the University of California, San Diego. His teaching and research focuses on state and local governments, urban politics, public opinion, and political communications, racial and ethnic politics, and gun politics. Among his many publications, recent articles include The Politics of Potholes, Analyses of Influence on Ballot Measures, and Instant Runoff Voting, an examination of 4 ranked choice elections. And you can find that, just by Googling it. He has several publications that are very interesting. As you know, one of our league members, Joe Maisel, leads our Electoral Reform Committee and has actively spearheaded ranked choice voting across New York State. He led our league to adopt the New York City position in 2022, and his presentation at the New York State League Convention that year led to a league study that will be released for statewide consensus meetings early in 2025, so we can look forward to seeing what the study shows. Professor Burnett, we welcome you, and we look forward to you sharing all your views and ideas in a conversation with us.
I don't know that I know how to do this. So thank you for the very warm welcome and such nice things to say. Yeah, please read my publications. They're not, they don't. As we say, we publish them and we wonder how many times they actually get read. So I'd be welcoming the views there. So I'm here to talk about what just happened. Oh yeah, sure. I can. If I could figure it out, I can. Here, I'm gonna try. Is that better? Okay, there we go. I figured it out. Is it too close? You'll yell at me if it's too close. It's not bad. Well, I don't know. I'm talking into it. Okay. I mean, that's almost like in my mouth. So I can also just talk louder too. That is the easier solution probably than bumping into this. So I will enunciate. I'm here to talk about what just happened a couple weeks ago when we were talking about setting this up. Gosh, I don't know when exactly that was. Maybe it was September, August. I'm not. Is that right? Okay, so I think at the time in September when I received the email, we were still kind of in that moment when Harris looked like she was really kind of enjoying a wave up, and all the pieces were kind of coming together. And I said, well, this is looking like an election that might be done. And then a couple more weeks passed, and I kept following the polls, and I kept digging into the numbers and sort of looking at the states and sort of tracking. Ooh, and I got this 2016 feeling at that point. And I went into my class and I said, guys, I don't know. I can't tell you. The polling is weird. But I'm seeing a lot of signs here that tell me that Trump might walk away with this one. And I said, I can't tell you for certain, and I would not put any money down on that. Somebody did put $30 million down on that and won some money. But I wouldn't personally, because I knew kind of this, how the methodology was going with the polling, and it's a whole new world in that way. And so I was this is probably the election I have been the least confident about in terms of predicting. And I certainly had 2016 going for Clinton. 2020 I had probably even a bigger margin for Biden, and the polling was certainly suggesting of that. This time, I really didn't feel good about putting my name down on who was going to win. In the end, I ended up actually sort of going with Harris. The polling was that confusing that even the Thursday before the election, I sort of put my hat on. I taught in North Carolina for 6 years, and that's a state I know. And I kind of thought North Carolina was going to go for Harris. That was my surprise pick of the evening. I said, I actually had a map, a strange map, that had it so she didn't need to win Pennsylvania. Anyway, I was wrong. I was very wrong. And then, actually, the funny thing is by Monday, my thoughts had changed on that. And if I had done the class again on that Monday, which I don't teach on Monday, but if I did, I would have gone the other direction because the polling had stacked up again. The tranche of polls that were released from Thursday to Sunday were all clearly kind of pointing in the same direction. The only one that was really kind of odd was that Iowa poll. It sort of stuck out, and I said, well, geez, if she's right, this is really that means everyone else is really wrong. She was wrong, as it turns out, and she's no longer in the polling business. I think she had already, well, look, that's not a knock on her. She had already decided she was done. But, that sort of, if there wasn't a case to sort of keep going, I don't know that she saw much of one on this election. So, that was sort of my personal analysis on this, trying to apply, quite honestly, the best political science I can to looking at the election. That I was up and down, up and down, up and down, just like everyone else. And the reality is, it kind of came in as a little bit of a surprise, and then also not a surprise in some ways. And so, I'm going to try to walk through this and not only talking about what actually happened in terms of the results, and please feel free to ask about any result you'd like to know about. You may need to give me some background if it's a local election I didn't quite pay attention to. But I'm happy to sort of give you my read on anything. But I do want to kind of, as best as I can, try to give you a little bit of what political science has to offer in terms of understanding this election. Because no doubt you guys have read countless articles, opinion pieces, right? But that doesn't usually match up with the way that political science sees the world. We tend to see it in a different way, and in my training, even probably different than most. So here's what we know so far, and I want to say so far because the reality is we will know a lot more in a couple years, and I know that's really unsatisfying. But there's things that will happen in a couple years. One is we're going to get some additional feedback, midterm election, the next election, the next general. But also there's going to be some really useful pieces of data that are coming out. Nobody in this room would be paying attention to this. This is really inside political science kind of stuff. But they are big enterprises that are out there collecting 50, 60,000 people in a survey over the course of an election, and they're tracking how they're feeling and responding and all that sort of stuff. So the post-mortem on this, at least as far as political science is concerned, hasn't even begun. So in a year or two, when all this data comes out, we'll know more, and we'll know exactly what was going on with the voters and all that. Right now, I'm making my interpretations based on what I can see from 10,000 feet above. And that's not really the best way to do this a lot of the time, but it's unfortunately the best that we have right now. Where we like to live and breathe the best we can is in the individual space. So we look at how individual voters and then aggregate up those into groups and say, well, look, you see the individual behave this way, but when you look at the whole group, that's when the mystery starts to unravel a little bit. So we don't have those data sources yet. We have exit polls, and that's nice. But exit polls are really short, and they are done in the moment, and they're self-administered, and there's a lot of things that can go wrong in an exit poll, and their sampling is done in a specific way that is very useful on election night, but not so useful in actually uncovering the answers to the questions of why did this happen. So here's what we know. We had a red shift. It's pretty clear. Pretty much every, I think, with the exception of a few places, right? You can look across the country and they had, I saw the graphics just like you did. The red arrows, red arrow, red arrow, red arrow. It's going to the right, it's going to the right. And it did. It clearly did. We didn't get a huge sort of reverberation up and down Congress. We didn't get it in the House. We did see some seats change in the Senate, but it wasn't some sort of giant red wave crashing, was it? I mean, it didn't sort of, you didn't see, there's certain tidbits out there that hint that there's a lot going on underneath the surface that we don't quite understand. But there is that red shift that we have to see and we have to acknowledge. That Trump won, and he won pretty easily, as it turns out. He won all the states he needed to and more. Uh, and he may not hit that 50% threshold, but that is looking at the wrong thing. He won the popular vote. The fact that he won the popular vote is something he's never done before. So he did win the popular vote, even if it's not 50%. And he's conversely, as you're seeing that red shift, you're seeing a decline in blue voters as well. So both are happening at the same time. There seems to be an enthusiasm gap on the Democratic side in particular. That voters just, at least this time around, the greatest hits didn't bring him out to the polls. There's an assumption that Trump is this huge driver of Democratic turnout, and maybe after so many years of this, that message isn't playing quite the same way as it used to. We all get tired of that song after a while. So that's happening. Near majority for Trump, but there's also something going on that we pay a lot of attention to what's going on in the national zone. Perfect. We should. It's important. It's the Super Bowl of politics, after all, and we all watch the Super Bowl, don't we? But when we look at what's going on and say ballot measures, questions that appear on the ballot, policies that voters are voting directly on. So this isn't just sort of an expression of, I'm going to vote for Trump or Harris, and gosh, it could be one of 15 or 20 or 30 reasons why, and one of those reasons might be the reason, and the rest might not be that important. There's something really cool that goes on with ballot measures, and that is because it is a policy, and it's an idea, and it's an expression of how they want that policy to go, and there's no intermediary in between, right? It's just, do you want this or do you not? So there was one here in New York, our constitutional amendment, and it did pass. And that passed with 62-ish, somewhere around there. I didn't quite see the final numbers. But it passed. And it passed within the margin I pretty much expected to. In fact, the polling was pretty close on that one. There wasn't a ton of polling on that question, but it had it in the low 60s, and it hit right on the nose for the most part. Yet, while that's all happening, in Congress, in New York, two of the most competitive seats, flip, they go blue. That's strange. Yet, Trump wins Nassau County. First time a Republican wins it in, since 88, right? So, or no, 84 maybe. It's been a long time. So, Republicans did well, and yet there are also signs that maybe Democrats did okay too, at least in certain pockets. Yet, that's New York's story, and New York's story might be a little unique in this way. Not so unique. There's a lot going on. But if you go to California, you're going to see something different. You're going to see a pretty normal vote for Harris, but you're going to see some other things that happen too. You're going to see that the increase question for minimum wage from $15 to $18 failed. And up until this year, every single minimum wage measure had passed. And yet the liberal bastion state of California says no. They also passed a pretty sweeping crime bill, making it tougher on crime. What's going on in California? Nothing much, actually, I'd tell you, because California, and I know some people will remember this, California was a state that in 1994 passed Proposition 187, and it tried to anyway, got caught up in the courts and didn't get through, but it tried to remove all services away from people who are undocumented citizens. This is California in 94. You had a Republican governor back then too. In the 2000s, California passed a same-sex marriage ban not once, but twice. The first time, statutorily, that gets caught up in the courts, so they pass it as a constitutional amendment 8 years later. This is all starting to tell a similar story here, in that there's something going on with voters, and I'm going to get back to this. So we see all that going on, and then we look at what's going on nationally, and we see there again, we have all three branches. I didn't say the trifecta, did I? I'm talking about all three branches, the Supreme Court included in that, are now heavily Republican. The House is close, I give you that. And that is the biggest challenge for Trump, is how is he going to manage, well, I guess in a curious way, Matt Gaetz is no longer there, and he was one of the most unruly members in that party. So he's gone, but there's still plenty of them around who are a bit ornery and not very polite Republicans. Are they going to continue to be the kind of rabble rousers that they were the last 2 years? Or are they going to snap to because Trump's in town and Trump's going to boss them around? I don't know. These are questions I don't know the answer to. We're going to have to just wait and see exactly how far the Republican Party will bend. So far, if we're watching Gates as an indicator, he withdrew today. So well in advance of even putting the nomination actually formally up, right? The feedback mechanism coming back from the Senate is this isn't going to fly. So there's that tricky little thing in the Constitution, right, that says if the House and the Senate disagree about whether or not they go into recess, the president can force them out of recess and then bloop, 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 put all those appointments through. This, to me, tells me that's probably not going to happen. But stay peeled for that, and I'll talk more about that if you want. So that's what happened. There's a lot there. The question is why. So we've got, I think, something we're just sort of all experiencing here, and it's not particularly fun because there's not really a great explanation here yet, and that is we are in some part of a cycle. This is really kind of a cyclical thing to me, and I'm going to get to why that's the case in just a minute. I think it's part cyclical, so some of this is just sort of out of anyone's control. I think some of this is reflecting really a true frustration amongst American voters. And let me sort of, and I've got, clearly the pandemic played into this even all these years later. There's a question about what kind of policies out there. Inflation's driving people nuts. That's all true. But I'm going to go back even farther, and I'm going to tell you, in 2008, the American public did something kind of crazy. They elected for president one of the least experienced people ever. Why? They wanted something different. In fact, the man I'm speaking of, Barack Obama, literally ran on that change slogan, didn't he? He said, change you can believe in. And what did they get? Roughly a year and a half of some policy making. They got, Obamacare and some other policies that made real impact, but not sweeping change. And this is not what American politics is going to bring you. I could have told you, if I could talk to every single American voter in 2008, and I could say, look, definitely vote for change, but go in with a good mindset that you're only going to get some. You won't get all. So we see that. And then we see basically a walking away from that in 2010. We get a big reverberation back. 2012, we continue with Obama, and that's because you got a mainline candidate up in Mitt Romney. He's not really a super big change candidate. He's about as, I remember he went pretty hard at the time. At the time, it was considered very right-wing. And we're all kind of watching, go, here's a guy from Massachusetts, and he's sort of pretending to be like he's from Alabama. Okay, but it didn't work, right? And we kind of knew that, it's sort of, there is that authenticity thing in American politics that people like. It's why people say that they voted for George W. Bush, right? Well, why do you like George W. Bush? I feel like I can have a beer with that guy. He feels authentic to me. Mitt Romney was not authentic, right? He did not come across as authentic. And then there's Trump in 2016. So we go from the least experienced person to even less experienced, right? He's never held elected office again. He's saying things that, gosh, 1/10 of those things that he said in terms of extremity would have killed anyone's candidacy. The escalator ride. That's enough. I even remember saying some comment. This is 2015. So I must have been still at UNC Wilmington, and I must have commented to my students. I remember saying this. I said, "Well, that was a quick one. Like that's all we're going to see of him." Joke's on me. Look, nobody understood at the time that there was this sort of playbook out there. I mean, I guess it's known, but the idea that you could do this in America was sort of. Didn't quite ring. It didn't quite ring true. But there is a playbook, as it turns out, where if you just ignore it and just power through, apparently people forget or they stop thinking it's all that important. And so that is worked for him. And it's But why? Why did we vote for Trump in 2016? Change. They wanted something radically different. They asked for it again. What did they get? Not much. They got a 2017 Tax Cuts and Job Act, which, probably for most of us in this room, probably just increased our taxes, honestly. Salt tax, right? So, that's probably the biggest effect for most of us. But they didn't get much else. Right? There's not much else. There was a lot of political battles that rolled out. His policy was frustrated. This is probably good news for people who don't want his policy, but for the American public, they didn't know what they were asking for exactly. They're not thinking that in that much sophisticated, thought processes, but they are asking for something different. They didn't really get that either. And so 2020 was sort of a go back to normal. It was really close, just like 2016. And here we are in 2024, and we know all this. We know exactly how he governed. There's no surprises. I tell my class in American government, Trump went from being the least predictable president or candidate of any kind in 2016, 2015, to being the most predictable. Why? He does what he says. It's why voters like him. He does. He will try to do what he says. He will try to do it all. His nominees so far reflect exactly that ethos. So he will try. He will try. What does that mean? Well, we're going to get into that a little bit later. But right now, I want to turn to the handout that I had passed out here to go through what sort of political science can help you understand a little bit. So let's start with this little curve thing here. Anybody like statistics like me? No? A little bit? Okay. I'll do my best here. I'll demystify it. By the end of this talk, hopefully you don't hate it. All right. We'll try. So this is what we call a normal distribution. It's normal. I know. It's like a hump. It's weird, but it is normal. And the reason I say it's normal is because the curve actually represents some measurement of how many observations, or in this case, people, might exist in that space. And so you can kind of look at this and you go, oh, that's too far left and too far right. Well, there are people who exist in those frames, right? There are people who are extremely conservative, but there's this many of them. And then there are those people who are extremely liberal, and there's that many of them. And then everyone else is some shade of, and you can get to be very liberal without becoming extreme, and you can get to be very conservative without becoming extreme. What it means is actually, this is a concept called standard deviation. It just means a measurement of how different you are from the average. Truth is, 95% of us are within 2 standard deviations of each other. In fact, almost 70% of us are within 1. That means we're actually pretty similar. Yeah, I know. We've been talking a lot about how crazy politics is, and we're super polarized. And we are, but we also aren't. Some people are polarized. In fact, we're just listening to the really polarized elements right now. But we've become more polarized over the years. But this is what this looks like. We have too far liberal, too far right. Now let me explain what's actually going on in this chart. So that's a good way to understand what sort of you're looking at. To the left is very liberal ideas, to the right is very conservative. And you can kind of see that the distribution is big and fat in the middle, right? Where that indicates that most of us are actually kind of moderate, really. And I know that's weird. We're liberal, we're conservative. But you might hold some liberal ideas and some conservative ideas, and I might do the same, right? And so that actually pushes us into that moderate space pretty much, doesn't it? So this is from another political scientist, not mine, and this is, I guess you would consider it old political science at this point, but it's not really, when I was in grad school, it was 15 years old, so now it's significantly older. But this is from a very talented public opinion scholar, and he, I think rightfully, points out that really it comes down to this fact that most Americans don't really care that much about policy. They're not intensely caring about policy. And so long as it's within a band of sort of what's normal, they'll find it acceptable. And so he calls this the zone of acquiescence, that if you're legislating policy in this zone, you're not going to get an extreme response. You're not going to get voters to say, whoa, that's too liberal, or whoa, that's too conservative. But that gets us to the next slide. And so this is a dotted line, but you could kind of imagine this, I think an analogy is helpful here. And you can kind of see that he's put, on his chart, he has this space that's marked as too liberal. He's got the space that's marked as too conservative. And then there's that zone in the middle of the dashed lines, and that's the zone of acquiescence. So that's the sort of moderate space. There's a couple things you can look at here, but I'll have you use an analogy first. And you can imagine a boat going down a meandering river. Maybe nobody's paddling, or maybe only one person's paddling, but somebody is paddling, and it hits into the shore. What happens when it hits into the shore? Well, in the policy world, you don't just beach it and get out and leave and say, all right, we're done with American government, see you later. That's not how that works. We have another election, right? And it's those elections where they actually tell you, hey, by the way, the ship bumped into the shore, and we're going to have to get somebody else to steer the boat to put it back in the middle of the water. And that is what I think happened today, or a couple weeks ago. You had a long period of discussion about policy in the policy space that was very concerned about things like identity politics, about transgender rights, on and on and on. It's about policing. These are progressive ideas. These are progressive policies that people are talking about. So the country, for a fairly long period of time, largely I think in reaction to the previous period of time, which is the Reagan era, which was going conservative, 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 boop, hit the side of the river, right? And then we go back to the left, right? So that kind of starts under Clinton, but it, picks up over time. And then we were sort of in the middle for a long time, George W. Bush. Probably Obama is shifting a little to the left, right? But Obama was pretty centrist, right? So Trump is legislating kind of weirdly. Honestly, he's not really a conservative. The one thing, the really big thing he got was very, certainly a conservative wish list, but his policy ideas aren't strict. They're not neoconservative policies, right? He's not that guy. So this seems to be an election where the rhetoric, all of it comes together, the fears about the pandemic, all of it, under Biden, and they view him as a president who legislated too much to the left. That is how I think the electorate viewed him. It is why Trump ran so many advertisements. How many of you guys watched any football during election season? Or if you're like me, I watched the World Series and all the playoffs. I was rooting for the Mets until they lost. And how many times did I watch the trans rights ad from Trump? I can't tell you. It's a lot, though. I don't know. I didn't keep a pitch count clock to see how many of those they came across. But it was all the time. And so they thought it was worthwhile, and having talked to a number of people on the inside in Democratic circles, they also think it was very effective too. It did seem to tap into something. I wasn't sure how much to make of it. I assumed the economy would be primary, and I think it was. I think a lot of this is reflecting that you did have a sort of a mostly economy-driven, inflation, post-pandemic driven response, yet there's all sorts of things in this soup, and this was one of them. So it's likely, at least in part, if you buy into my analogy here, the boat hit the shore, and the boat is now on its way back farther away from the liberal shoreline toward the center, maybe very quickly to the right shoreline, though, depending on how Trump legislates. So that is, I think, if you're unhappy with the way the election turned out, you can kind of take some solace in this, that if he legislates so hard to the right, it will induce another course correction, because that is what American politics does. Look, every elected official loves to talk about how this is the next permanent thing. We have a permanent conservative majority. In the 2000s, early 2000s, Roy Teixeira is telling everybody, look, if we just become a more immigrant-friendly country, everybody's going to vote for the Democrats because that's what minority voters do. That's not correct. That's not correct. And it was never correct. I mean, Latinos do not vote like African American voters. There's very good reasons why. Not to get into too much, but there is this concept in American government called linked fate as it relates to African American voters that they, in surveys, they actually report that they will vote against their interests, their own financial interests, because they're voting for what's good for people who are like them, other black people. And that has never been the case with Latino voters. And the theory goes is it has a lot to do with economic subjugation and a shared history. So there's too much to probably get into today. But there's good reasons. So that's sort of builds, I think, the case that there is some cyclical natures to this. The other thing that is, I think, almost certainly at play now, and I probably have, in my previous talks here, I've probably, in years past, however many years ago now, probably threw out the idea, because I certainly was selling the idea to anyone who would listen, is that we were on the cusp of, or potentially in already, a realignment. So when I talk about realignments, it's useful for me to sort of go and talk about what causes a realignment. And typically what precedes a realignment is what we call a critical election. And we've had them in the past, and they are usually fairly spaced out, and they kind of work as you would expect. The country changes, issues change, policies that didn't exist before that now need to be legislated come into play. And so that puts a lot of pressure on the existing coalitions, and the existing coalitions sometimes fail under those pressures. So I'll give you the list that I have. You can take debate with any of these, I suppose, but most people generally agree. The first one was in 1800 with Jefferson. It was the first time we had negative campaigns. It was the first time we didn't have agreement about somebody just being the next president. Well, that also ushers in the era of good feelings, and the Federalist Party disappears, right? So a total realignment. Really, and back then parties aren't really functioning like parties today, not even close. But the next one is Jackson in 1828. Right? And that brings about what you and I would recognize as the beginning of the modern party system. That's in response to the corrupt bargain of 1824, but the critical election, 1828, and the advent of the Jeffersonian Democrats, the spoils system, all that good stuff. The next one, Lincoln, 1860, the rise of the Republicans, the decline of the Whigs. The next one, 36 years later, 1896, we have McKinley and Williams Jennings Bryan, who runs on the Cross of Gold speech, getting rid of the gold standard. A whole reimagining of the U.S. financial system. I know that's sort of, it'd be like saying we're going to replace the American dollar with Bitcoin. That is what he was offering, right? That is the level of change that Williams Jennings Bryan was pushing for at the time. The idea you would ever get off of the gold standard was radical. So he almost wins. That's a questionable election. Good history there. And then the next one, now we're getting into the more modern times. 1932, Roosevelt. And you could go back to 1828 if you wanted to pick Al Smith as sort of that realignment kind of election, because he really brings in immigrants and Catholic voters to the Democratic Party. But the 1896 election is actually probably the most important in my mind, because that is the election that sets, up until this election, for the most part, the current coalitions. The major components of those coalitions, of course, being working class voters. That is the divide from 1896. And the last critical election, 2016. That's my argument. 2016. And what would you expect to see if you have had a critical election and you are in the process of realigning your coalitions, which makes it very difficult to predict outcomes of elections, thanks. But here's what I would expect to see, and this is actually what we saw. Split ticket voting increases. People vote one way for the president, but they vote differently down the ballot. In fact, one might argue that all of the ballot measures about abortion really allowed people to go and pull the lever for Trump and then turn around and enshrine abortion rights in their own state's constitution, and they felt fine about doing that. They felt that they had done a good job. They got everything they wanted. So split tickets, we see senators winning in Arizona. We see them winning in Nevada. We see governors winning in North Carolina by 17 points in North Carolina. That's the last time I looked at the number. It was so far gone. So we're seeing a lot more ticket splitting, which means voters are walking into that voting booth and they are holding more than one thought in their minds at the same time. That also means that you expect certain ballot measures to pop out differently. So New York won. Yes, this is why it passed. Because people went and they voted for Trump, and then they still voted for New York Constitutional Amendment 1. And they felt fine about doing that. They felt that this was a coherent vote for them. Abortion measures went down. Crime passed in California. Marijuana went down in Florida. Yet, if they had different rules, it would have passed because it hit 56%. So people voted for marijuana, a majority of them did, and they also voted for Trump. That's how they're voting right now. So we're splitting our tickets a lot. We're not voting in the way that the political science Philip Converse in 1964 would just pull his hair out over this stuff. You know, lamenting the fact that we are not very organized voters, our brains are messy, and we sometimes say liberal things and sometimes we say conservative things, and it does not look like we have much of an ideology. He's right. We don't. We're messy voters. We're busy. We hold a lot of thoughts and considerations in our head at the same time. And sometimes that means we go vote for Trump and then we pass an abortion constitutional amendment too. So that's what's happening. What's next? Sort of wrap this up and I'll open up to any questions you guys have. I don't know exactly. Trump is, in many ways, super predictable. Just listen to what he says. If you listen to what he says, that's what he's going to try to do. He will, I think, he's going to try, you're going to see tariffs. Right? I don't know how much, but he's going to. It's a campaign promise at this point. He's going to follow through in some way. You might see some attempts at recess appointments for people he really wants to see in. I could see that maybe for somebody he feels really connected to and like really close to. I don't think that's going to be Matt Gaetz. You know, he's already out. But like, you know, if there's somebody like that, I don't know what those personal relationships are. So only Trump can tell you when he feels like it's going to be time for him to step up and support his people. The thing that I'm looking out for, probably the most, is the end of the filibuster in the Senate. And you say, why Professor Burnett, why are you worried about that one the most? The Republicans haven't really talked about the filibuster. In fact, they seem to want to support it. Yeah, I agree. But when policy isn't going to get done, I'm very worried about them going to, well, not worried, it's sort of, this is where my head goes, that they're going to pull the campaign advertisement, not even advertisement, just campaign speech from Harris, where she came out in support of ending the filibuster. And they're going to use Democrats' words for the reasoning why they should do it. So that's what I'm on the lookout for. The real things I need to really understand if I'm telling you the truth today, if I'm telling you the truth that we are in the middle of a realignment, we've had a critical election, even though it might be 30, 40, 50 years late, somewhere in there. We finally had one, and this is what it looks like. But if I'm telling the truth, I will know by 2028 for sure, but I might know by 2026. What kind of blowback are we going to see? Are we going to see a normal kind of oscillation in which the president's party typically gets punished in the midterm election? And so then you certainly see the House flip. I don't have great news to say about the Senate, though. If you've looked at the 2026 Senate map, it's a tough one for Democrats. They're not going to be able to pick up all that many seats, so they may have to live with the idea that they're not going to have the Senate. But the most fascinating part, of course, is going to be how the Democrats respond in 2028. What's their message? The last one is not working. There's nothing wrong with Harris as a candidate. The only knock I can say is that she didn't have enough time, probably, and there's a reason why she didn't win the nomination in 2020. You know, the same reason that Clinton didn't win in 2008. They're not the strongest candidates in the field. And if you can't beat your own people in your own party, you're probably going to have a harder time in the general election. So in both cases, they were kind of, at least in 2016, Hillary Clinton she was such an overwhelming favorite. She wasn't really tested all in the way that you would think. And I realized that Sanders was there and pushed her in that way, but there wasn't really a realistic chance of Sanders walking away with that one. So that sort of tells me a lot. So what is, and the message has been consistent. Again, a basket of very, up until now, pretty popular progressive policies. What's 2028 going to look like? Who's it going to be? What are their demographics? But what's the message? What's the policy? Because right now, I don't think the Democrats have a winning coalition. And if the numbers I'm seeing are correct, the block voting behavior of African Americans may, as generations go on, it's probably going to significantly decline. That's my expectation. The reason why is, if you buy into the theory, and I certainly do, that there is this shared experience from the past that sort of shaped voting behavior, and that's typically the case for lots of groups. The connection to the civil rights era will continue to decline. That shared experience continues to wither for no other reason. It's the passage of time. And the people who are there are no longer here. So that's a lot. I don't know where we're going exactly, but I do think there's a lot that we can look at along the way. So I thank you for listening, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Any races you want to talk about, I'll do my best. Oh, that wasn't me. That was a new mic. I think. Oh, is it? It's like a conflict with the. Oh my goodness. This really doesn't like it. Oh. I can also paraphrase the question. Yeah.
Hello?
There we go.
Okay. Before you got up to speak, we were chatting in the back, and you mentioned that both political parties are weak, and that's why we're maybe not getting the best candidates.
Yeah.
And you've explained it somewhat. But
Yeah, no, you're right. There's a couple of so viewpoints on parties and strength. There's probably a couple lenses that are worth using. The first is sort of a global lens, and the U.S. parties have always been weak in this way because the Constitution, read the Federalist Papers, they basically set it up to try to keep parties at bay. They didn't like the idea of what was going on with the Tories and the Whigs and all that in England. They thought that was, this is Burke's writings. He sort of complains about parties all the time. So they try to make it so there aren't going to be any. But you can't really govern without them. So what are you going to do? So clearly they develop in the beginning, the first Congress. But they don't have much control. The thing that parties in other locales, Europe in particular, have is who gets elected. They control who gets elected. In fact, the exercise of voting in a lot of countries is wildly different than in America because you're not voting for a candidate. You pull the lever for the party and then they redistribute those votes. And so in those cases, parties have actually extreme amounts of powers because they actually rank you on a list. And then if you get 15 seats and you're number 16 on the list, you don't get a seat, right? So the party can put you up to 15 if they like you enough, but if they don't, you stay unelected, right? You're not representing. So that's one way to do it. The other is the American lens, is sort of a historical lens, if you will. So we are, by definition, a weak party system in a global context. Historically, we are also at a really weak point for party strength in an American lens. So going back to the beginnings of the sort of modern party system, the 1830s, essentially, they were pretty weak too. They were not ideological. They were basically what Jackson, and really I'm talking Van Buren, I mean, he's really the guy. He went out and got political clubs together and said, look, if you vote for Jackson, there might be a job. There will be a job in it for you. That's what got us the spoils system. He had to pay off people for all the votes that he was getting. And so kicked out of the old timers who'd been holding these positions for, in some cases, generations. They actually handed these down as sort of a bequeath to their son. And so those parties were not ideological. They just wanted to win. They wanted to win, and it was honestly about money and jobs most of the time. So that obviously changes when slavery and the Civil War come in, and sort of the Republican Party is really responsible for that, because the Democratic Party, as you guys probably know, had a North and a South wing to them, and they didn't get along particularly well. And the Republican Party comes in and kind of sorts that out, and that enters a period of relative strength of the party. Polarization tends to do that, and other than this era, the most polarized we've been is during the time of the Civil War. So that leads to a period of pretty strong partisan strength that sort of, I think, is carried through the 1890s or so into the Gilded Age. And then party is important, but the Republican Party is very dominant in this era, and then the Progressive era comes in and kind of mashes up the parties a little bit. Progressives existed in both. That's where you get a lot of reforms across the country, big reform movement. The 16th, the 17th Amendment, 16th Amendment, your favorite amendment, income tax, and the 17th is the directional. What's that? Oh yeah, that's true. Your favorite that you pay every year is the 16th, and then the 17th Amendment is the direct election of senators. And yes, the 19th Amendment is part of that, along with prohibition. So you get these four sort of really progressive amendments in that era. But in terms of the strength of parties, the real sort of important one is that progressives are really trying to actually break parties at this point. Right? They don't want them to be able to pick senators anymore, because that had become extremely corrupt and very partisan. And they didn't trust the states to collect taxes anymore either, because there was a lot of greed and graft. So they wanted a way to get their own source of revenue. That was the income tax. And they wanted a way to sort of have a little less bad behavior going on in the Senate. And that was the direct elections of senators. But they really just wanted to take power away from the parties. This is the era of the decline of the political machine. So parties sort of enter a phase of being relatively weak, but Republicans are very dominant. There's not really a great issue for the Democrats. For a while, it was maybe staying out of World War I, but you know how that turned out. So what really the era is kind of normal, kind of tame, and then you get the New Deal coalition, right? So a pretty good era of party strength. The differences between the parties are very clear, and that lasts for a while. And then you get to the 70s. The 70s is an era where, I know it's weird, Nixon was really trying to position himself as more of a moderate, all the while he's running the Southern strategy and all that. But he is symbolic of kind of the parties are not super far apart. It's not, the party strength is not really a big deal yet. And that's a lot of that has to do with this, how dominant the New Deal coalition is in Congress. There's really no hope for Republicans to run the chamber. So there isn't a lot of party discipline. And that changes in the 90s. Right? That changes in the 90s. And that the parties become really important in identity. But there's something that happens in that period from the 60s to the 90s that's actually really fundamental, that weakens the parties. And that is the advent of the primary process. Up until 68 and really 72, it is the parties who select the presidential candidates. I know, the smoke-filled rooms, all that stuff. You can read the biography on Truman. It's a very good inside account of how sort of he gets picked as the vice president, and it's just kind of this really murky process, right? It's sort of, you got to go here, you got to make sure this person's happy. There's no real consideration of what voters consider at all. Read the electing of the president in 1960. JFK runs in West Virginia to prove that non-Catholics would vote for him. It doesn't matter that he wins enough delegates at the primaries to be the presidential nominee. He's doing it for a purpose. He's not doing it to get delegates. It had been that way for so long, and the parties selected people on really just one criteria: who can win. That's what they picked. You take that out, you add basically a determinative primary process, and now you've left it up to the voters, and in particular the voters who happen to show up on those elections. So look at what happens in 2016 as a result of all these institutional changes. 2016 is a clear, I think to me, the Republicans did not want Donald Trump to be the nominee. But why didn't they win? Why didn't that faction win? They were not strong enough. They did not have the ability to go to Marco Rubio, our what was he selected for? I can't remember anymore. Our Secretary of State, yeah, our incoming Secretary of State at the time, his biggest opponent, didn't say very nice things about Trump. But the party didn't go to all the other people running, John Kasich and Ted Cruz, and say, look, we don't want Trump, right? So you got to drop out and endorse. You got to endorse somebody. Marco would be great. Endorse Marco. They didn't do that. They didn't do that. And Trump won on pure name recognition all the way down. He had 100% name recognition entering the primary. That netted him 30% of the votes. And then eventually that 30% turned into 40%. And that 40% turned into over 50%. And nobody stopped him. That is a weak party, not being able to control who you put up for an election.
I'm curious if you could speak on the power of money in the election with big oil and dark money, together with the misinformation. And even here locally, we saw a really well-funded disinformation campaign that I'm sure affected the outcome here as well as nationwide. But to me, it's unchecked capitalism. To me, Trump is sort of a symptom of that.
Yeah, I mean, money is one of those things that's it's both incredibly important, and then at the same time, it may not be all that important. It's weird to sort of say that, I know, but you can raise $1 billion, but if somebody's already made up their mind, what's that $1 billion going to buy you except an unchanged mind? And that is true for a lot of voters. Messages, after a while, they become noise. They're just, I mean, we're not in a battleground state. I used to live in one. After a while, it doesn't matter. It's just political noise. It's back. It becomes white noise. So money, disinformation can all matter. In super close elections, disinformation could be really important. I'm not sure exactly which case you're referring to here. I'd be happy to take specifics, but yes, in any scenario, you can envision how this could matter. I mean, if people are misinformed, truly misinformed, then they could vote incorrectly, of course. Yeah, I need some specifics to sort of play that out a bit more, but in terms of this election, at least in terms of the presidential election, I mean, most people had made up their minds well in advance. I mean, June, 95% of the country is already in the bag for one or the other, and this is before Biden drops out. And then Biden drops out, and look, it changes the race a little bit in the middle, and people have to kind of figure out where they're going to be. But those people settle really quickly too, for the most part. And by the end of the election, when most of the money is being spent, you're talking about chasing percentages of voters, single low percentages of voters. If you run the numbers on when people decide, the number of people who decide in the last week is really low. The last month is low, but it's infinitesimal when you get to the last couple weeks. So I'm more concerned with money in politics. The things that concern me are more along the lines of what maybe Elon Musk does in Pennsylvania. I find that a bit abhorrent, because I don't think that our politics should allow somebody with that kind of money to just come in and do something like that, when most people wouldn't be able to, and that to me is something that I'm not sure how to remedy that. I didn't like the idea that it walked right up to the line of paying people to register to vote. So that to me was really problematic. But at the end of the day, did it change a lot of people's votes? Probably not enough to flip Pennsylvania or certainly not North Carolina. So, if it was a super close election, you probably hem and haw it more, but in many ways it wasn't close enough to worry too much about. But money in politics is, I think it matters, but I also think at some point you run into what we call the minimal effects hypothesis, and that is a hypothesis that advertising really actually doesn't do that much.
What about all the different social media, every kind of media that is available to people, and the fact that for maybe 20, 25 years, people have been watching what they want to watch or listen to what they want to listen in terms of disinformation? Because to me, my impression is that there are a lot of people who really don't know. They don't know their history. They don't know they don't have much memory of what's really happened, and they've been told things that they base their vote on, but based on who they hang out with and what programs they watch.
There has been a lot more echo chambering and you're 100% right. The advent of Fox News changes the landscape. They're not really doing anything more than what is feasible, sensible. Honestly, the market is, the mainstream news. It was and is slightly left of center. Not because they are like sitting down with their hats on and going, "Hey, let's be just left of center today, guys." No, it's because they engineer their editorial. For the longest time, it was to target a specific demographic with advertising. Stay-at-home mothers. That's who they were targeting. The people who made financial decisions about what to buy. And that's who advertises on the nightly news. So Fox News watches all this, or Rupert Murdoch, I guess. And he says, well, I'll just plunk one down here to the right of everybody, and I'll grab that marketplace. And he did. That, to me, is normal. That's just market forces at play. But social media is a little different. That is, getting a editorial sort of point of view from a conservative standpoint. If there isn't, you don't think there's one out there, and you're sure you can provide it and you can succeed, that's fine. Maybe even better, right, to have more viewpoints expressed. You may feel differently about it, but you may say, well, the content matters. And I can agree to that too. But clearly he's making a choice about where the market is and where I can make money, right? So it's a business decision. That's kind of what social media is doing, but there's no editorial control. And if somebody posts something that's disinformation on social media, it's a lot harder to get after them, unless they're somebody famous, I guess, or doing so much of it that they get attention that would be like from somebody who says it's worth my time. But for the most part, there's no regulation there. So even Fox News, right? They lost almost $1 billion to Dominion. Mm-hmm. So they're two different kinds. So for me, social media is potentially more problematic because you're getting fed not just things you want, right? So somebody who's watching Fox News, they just went to the store and they bought Tide instead of All. They looked at the detergents and they said, I like Tide. I'm going to get Tide today and every day from here on out. Somebody on social media is like the equivalent of walking down the laundry detergent aisle in your store and somebody's replacing all the other brands of soap as you walk down with only Tide or Super Tide or Tide with this flavored scent, right? It's more of the same, but they're trying to figure out what's going to keep you going and going and going, and they don't care Unlike Fox News or anybody like them, where they can get sued and punished for lying to you. And I know that doesn't mean they get caught for all lies, I understand. But they can for certain things, and if they continue to do it, and they do it over and over and over and over and over again, that price tag had $1 billion the last time they did it. So social media, not chained that way. And that means that if you're a young person, and this is where you're getting the majority of your news from, you do have the potential to walk out with a pretty warped view of what's going on in this world, unfortunately. I do agree with that. How do you counteract that? Well, that's what I try to do in the classroom as much as I can, but I only get 30 or so students at a time. So it's a real policy problem. This is where I think there probably needs to be some thought in about if, and this is the same thing Facebook had to confront, right? They wanted to be seen as the new town square, and they invited politics in, and they could not come up with a reasonable way to regulate it, and so they stopped doing politics. And I think that choice will probably have to come before most social media platforms at some point or another, because if you're going to deliver the news and if you're going to have a news-like quality to you, you will eventually have to answer for those things.
I was just going to say that this seems to have started further away from what we're talking about here, and that is the beginning of Trump with his birther repetition.
Mm-hmm.
Get my point?
Yeah.
Repetition. So he did it over and over and over again, and it worked.
Mm-hmm.
And, I mean, maybe Kamala was saying we're not going back over and over again, but she also did not say anything positive about what the Biden administration had accomplished in terms of all of the programs. We never heard a thing about them from her. Nothing about and the fact that so many of those programs were being taken up by Republican governors, to fix their roads and to fix their bridges, et cetera, do all these wonderful things. We never heard a word about it. Not a word. She didn't do repetition that way at all. And yet she only had 3 months to do it, of course. But, Biden before her should have been saying those kinds of things. I don't know. It just seems to me misinformation about the birther thing, worked. It's wrong. Just the way all this social media stuff is wrong. I don't know where to go with that, except to truth and repeat it, as opposed to repeating stuff that's not true.
Yeah, in my mind, and I think this has been true, and I think you'll probably take this as true. Republicans are better at branding. They're just better at branding. They get it. They've thought about it a lot more for whatever reason. They always find a way to pitch something that just gets right at that pressure point. So when it was Obamacare, it was death panels, right? Death panels. It's just, I mean, like they find, and there's some fairly well-known people who work on this stuff, and they are conservative. But they do seem to have the upper hand in branding and messaging. You're absolutely right about these sort of construction and infrastructure that probably should have been played up more. You do run the risk of sort of saying we spent all that money and then them saying, well, that's why we have so much inflation, right? So there's sense that, and the truth of the matter is, and so you can say, well, there are other policies too, especially some things they were trying to do on social policy. I'm guessing, just like everybody, they did internal polls, and they found that message was not going to play. And if you look at the voting, they were right. The outcome could have been worse. I'm guessing they didn't have a lot of encouraging internal polls. That's my guess. They'll never share them. They're internal for that very reason. But I suspect that was that's going on. I also suspect because they had a shortened campaign, they were not going to be able to come up with the right counter programming to these headwinds that they would have discovered fairly late in the process, right? It takes a while to get a clearer picture of what the public wants and to try new policies and to try different frames around policies. And they just didn't have enough time to do that.
My question is, oh, did you want to speak first?
So I have 2 points. One question, 2 points. The first one is, the interesting thing for me about the billion-dollar payment that Fox was made to do is when they tried to tamp down a little bit, they lost audience to Newsmax and News One, whatever, Max One, whatever it is. So in order to stop that hemorrhaging of audience, their audience are telling them what they want at this point, which is an interesting problem for our side. Now, my other question is, 8 years ago, I was seeing a lot of charts which basically showed, it was, 2 scales. One scale was conservative to liberal, one scale was intensity of feeling. And 30 years ago, you had a lot of red dots, kind of just below the equator, up and across and across both quadrants. And a lot of blue dots, which some of them were above the equator, but all over the 2 cells. And over the past 30 years, what's happened is that the red dots have come together in a little cluster, significantly above the equator and all on the left side. And the blue dots are still a pretty big wave, if anything, even more so. And I'm thinking that part of what's going on is that it's easier to message to a tighter clump. And it's very difficult to message to people who are on both sides of some issues and have very different levels of intensity around those issues.
The 1896 election that I identified is the beginning of the Democratic Party having to deal with a diverse coalition of voters and to cobble it together. Voters that can get picked off and have been picked off over time. Reagan Democrat might ring a bell. So you're 100% right, though, that the messaging to a more cohesive party is always easier than messaging to a disparate party that holds lots of different beliefs, right? And just to take one example in the Democratic Party, the current sitting president, right? Personally, not for abortion. Policy for abortion, right? That's the kind of backflips that Democrats have to do to keep the coalition together and have been doing it for a very, very long time. Yeah, just more or less. I mean, look, it's the same problem when you've got Southern whites and African Americans the same party after the New Deal. You can basically go to any point in time, and it's pretty true. So I don't know how this will be taken, but and I haven't thought this through. This is more off the cuff, but I think about where the Republican Party was in 1964. Goldwater. Small, very small, had been beaten up over the years, lost, an election to Truman they should have won. They're just happy that Eisenhower decided to be a Republican. That's kind of where the Republican Party was. And so in 64, there's a very concerted interior Republican. There's a great book on it called Before the Storm, if you guys are interested. It's written by not a political scientist, so it's a better read. It's written by a journalist. And it kind of goes through all the machinations that happened in the lead up to the 1964. This is when, obviously, the parties are in control, so they pick their own, not having to run in a primary. And they go with Goldwater. He is clobbered, right? Just absolutely clobbered in 64. But he was ideologically pure. Right? And that's why they picked him. They picked the ideologically pure candidate who set the beacon for the Republican Party for now 60 years. So you do kind of, when you're on the outs, when you're a party on the outs, and I'm not saying the Democrats are on the outs, right? They're not where the Republicans were in the 50s and 60s. That's not the case. But they are doing some soul searching, right? And if you buy into my story that 28 is important because it is going to need to sort of set the agenda for that party, that sort of part of that playbook could be useful to think through what's the ideologically pure new Democrat that we want to put forward, right? What's the Democratic Party mean today, and how do we get that defined? And that may mean that person gets clobbered in 2028. That could be the case. But those chickens might come home to roost in not that long. And I know, well, it's Trump. It took 6 years. It was Reagan. They got it in Reagan. That was the payoff. Reagan was the payoff. So it was only 16 years. I know that's a relatively long time.
And the election of 1980,
Yeah.
the map is actually a landslide and a mandate, unlike this one.
Yeah, and even more so in '84 when he only lost one state. So, but yeah, so I mean, look, that is not necessarily where the Democrats are, but it is. What the Republican Party did is they did not go the direction of let's put up somebody who's like LBJ, right? And Nixon and Kennedy in '60 are really similar candidates, right? You could, if I read the party platforms to you, you might have a hard time telling me which one is which. So they didn't do that in '64. They went ideologically pure, and it cost them in the short and the medium run, but in the long run, it has set the tone of that party, and they've actually seemed to have been able to kind of do it again with Trump. Right? He's redefined. Reagan is not Trump. Trump is not Reagan. Right? Not even close. So it's happened where it's been redefined again. The Democrats haven't really done that since Clinton, '92. So, been a few decades, right? It's been a few decades since somebody's come in and said, hey, this is what our party means. Because who did Obama want to be? Bill Clinton. The only problem was he was running against his wife. If he wasn't, he would have had Bill Clinton's endorsement, right? Almost clearly. So, yes, to put a bow on that, Democrats have always been the messier coalition. And now that if it's truly the case that white working collar voters have left the Democratic Party, it's actually going to be less messy. A little bit.
151 million people voted this past election. 200 million were eligible to vote. Trump won 32% of the total electorate capable of voting. There were 40% did not vote. 40% of the people in this country that were eligible to vote did not. Would that have made, do you look at those statistics and understand what would motivate them to get involved?
I don't have a lot of good news there. Probably not much. I know that's not necessarily the best news for this group. Sorry. But you should keep trying. You should absolutely keep trying. But and you will make gains. You will, but it is frustrating because it comes down to kind of a simple formula. It's called the calculus of voting. I won't go through the actual calculus, but it boils down to two things. One is true, and you know it's true because you'll feel it when I say it, and there's a cost to voting. And I'm talking about, sure, money costs. You got to drive there, it's car maintenance and that sort of stuff. That's a dollar amount. But then there's the time and effort that takes too. And time is money. You've heard that before, and it is. There's a cost there. Effort's a cost as well. I have to figure out who to vote for, and then I got to show up to vote, and I have to spend my time waiting in line or doing something, right? I got to do something. It's not nothing. So it's positive. The cost is positive. Now, when rationally should I want to expend that cost? Rationally, if I'm being purely, deeply rational, the only instance I would ever vote if there's a cost is if I'm the decisive vote. So if I'm the one who gets to pick, I'm showing up. And if not, staying home. So that's how it's set up. And you go, well, wait, if that's true, how many people get to be the decisive vote? And I go, 0. Why 0? Because you never are. But even if you are, who actually says the outcome of the election? The courts do. So it's never really you're the decisive vote, and you can never know in advance, right? So the probability of you actually being the decisive vote is either 0 or it's what we say approaching 0. So you can just wash that out. So there's no benefit there. So there's a clear cost, but no benefit. That is what you're running into. But that still doesn't explain why 60% of us do vote, right? Well, we do because we feel that it's our duty to. We feel the efficacy. We feel that our voice matters. And so that's the problem you're running into. A lot of those, and some of it's just practically people are busy. They're not trying to be bad citizens. They're really not. They have kids. Some people have multiple jobs. They're trying to make ends meet. And at the end of the day, they're not like you and I. They don't sit down at the end of the day and look at politics and go, well, that's interesting. I'd like to read more. It's not their hobby. They don't look at it as entertainment like you and I do. We get a lot of entertainment value. We could talk about political scandals here all day and have a good hearty laugh. For them, they'll never heard of it. They're not really that interested. They may not even understand why it's a big deal. So those are the voters you're really talking about here. And it's finding how to motivate them to make it seem that the cost is worth defeating. So how do I defeat that cost? I might defeat it if I think it's a really close election. You tell me it's a really important election. You might be able to motivate me. And that's probably worked in 2020, right? But then you went back to those same people 4 years later and you said the exact same things. So after a while, the boy is crying wolf, right? And nobody shows up. That's how that story ends. So that's a way to put that in perspective. That if the reason that people don't vote is because they don't feel that duty, that efficacy, and so you are trying to appeal directly to that. Your voice matters. It's your duty to vote. Rah rah, go America, that kind of thing. But you're still challenged against the cost. And if they are not a habitual voter already, habits are both hard to break and they're also hard to start sometimes.
Unless this is Costa Rica where it's mandatory if
Or
you want a
Australia.
driver's license.
Or Australia, yeah. There's all sorts of models out there. But, then you question the quality of the vote, right? At that point. Sure. But at least you know the people who are there want to express an opinion. And it's not clear to me in this election, by the way, that if there was 100% turnout, that it would have, I think it still would have gone for Trump.
Yeah, I got a question about Swazi. He had 2 elections recently, and was there anything that you can find out from saying, okay, let's say he was going to get 55% in the first one, and let's say he was going to get 50% in the second one, but he only got 54%, but wow, he only got 46%. Is there any analysis that comes out of that? Because it's it's kind of like a little bit like Trump. Trump was in and it was out, and then so.
Yeah, Swazi, who
Mechanics, yeah.
yeah, my student actually ran his special campaign last year, so I have a bit of insight into that one. But that's the issue with specials. They are really special. There's nothing quite like them, and in that special, actually, I had lunch with a couple of my old students, and they asked me for my prediction on that. I got pretty close. I think I had a +6. I think it ended up a touch higher. It was like +8 on that. Anyway, I was not concerned about him winning. And the reason was because I knew voters were going to come out and punish the Republican Party, not because they did anything bad policy-wise, is because George Santos. They were not going to give it to a Republican no matter what on that election. So this is probably a better read as to where his support level is, because you can't really go back in previous elections after that, because you're talking about a different congressional map entirely. So this is a better thermometer reading on his support level than his special would be, because you have a full electorate this time. Next time, it'll probably enjoy a little boost, I would suspect, if midterms turn out normal. Does that get mostly to the answer?
Did we expect 60%, but we only got 52%?
You mean in terms
Yeah.
of turnout?
Is there any difference that occurred that you can explain why the voters shifted from, was there any difference from a year ago to now? And can you explain that?
In terms of Swazi specifically?
In terms of Swazi specifically, but also in terms of the voters' change of behavior, change of choices?
I couldn't compare a special
Okay.
to a, it's too weird of an electorate to get to, especially if it was a congressional only, if it was just a midterm, I'd probably feel more, because the turnout would be closer, because, you're looking at a midterm election that's closer to 40%. So you can at least say that that's going to be your more interested set of voters who would show up, and then that might be a better reflection to say this has changed and that hasn't. But no, I never extend much beyond a special as just take it in time as a picture of what things look like in that particular place at that particular time for those people, and a month later it could be wildly different, because especially with that election where it was always going to be a rebuke of being hoodwinked in the previous election.
Yeah, I wanted to just go back to Trump a little bit and kind of fast forward 4 years from now, and considering Project 2025 and him saying, vote for me this once, you'll never have to vote again. And what are you seeing? Will we still have a democracy 4 years from now?
I do. I think we'll have a democracy. I think it could be. I think our norms will be different. I think our norms have been changing a lot. They were, to be frank, they were changing before Trump got there too. Joe, what's his name? Member of Congress, Joe. It's not Lewis. That's a boxer. Forgetting his name. I think it was no. It's older. It's a specific moment during. I think it was 2013 State of the Union. His name is Joe, and I can't remember his name now, his last name. He gets up and he says, "You lie." Remember that moment? And that was a sort of just another signal that norms were different, right? Because I think they did censure him still. But here's the thing. I know now they would not even bother. They wouldn't even bother. So you want a worst case scenario, basically, is what you want to know. Okay. Let's go through this. Worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is on January 21st. Thank you. I knew it was Joe something. January 21st, the House votes to go into recess. The Senate does not. And the President Trump, puts them out of session. Quickly issues whatever appointments he wants. People who will never stop him. That to me, the House might go along with that. But how quickly the Senate would or wouldn't is a good question. But let's just say we're going worst case scenario. Okay, so they do that, so you get your worst of the worst, right? Your worst fears come alive. Nobody's been checked out. Wow. Okay, so we have a government that looks very much like Andrew Jackson's government at that point, right? One that's full of graft, openly stealing from public coffers. Everybody knows it. It's a drunken republic part 2, except Trump doesn't drink. So, but that's your worst case scenario. That's what's going on with the leadership. Then, of course, there's still some constitutional hurdles, though. I don't think you can get past. That third term's out of the question. You're not going to get there. That's too hard written in stone. So that I'm not thinking, but It's a constitutional amendment, so there's only one way to fix that, and that's the constitutional amendment process. So you got to get the House to sign off, 2/3, Senate 2/3, and then 3/4 of the states. Find me 3/4 of the states, they'll sign off. I don't think you can. So you're more likely to sort of, if he was really going to do that, it would be a straight up coup. That's what that's going to look like. Well, so the thing about the Constitution is it doesn't really care if you've left the White House or not. Power transfers, no matter what. So if you're not signed up, if your electoral college votes are not counted and certified by the House and the Senate, you do not have power. It has to happen. That is why January 6th was so important. So those constitutional things will still be there, and there is no way for them to undo them. Things, again, you can't even qualify for the ballot. So, that part I think is pretty hard stuck. But, if you have that kind of cabinet, and that would signal to me that you have a compliant legislature. That's the part where I'd get worried about. Look, in our nightmare scenarios, you've got Trump assassinating Democratic candidates or something. I mean, then you're Russia at that point. So, as is always the case, and this will either make you happy or not, it will always come down to what Congress wants to do. Congress is the 800 and the 900-pound gorilla in the room. There is nothing Congress can't do if it doesn't want to, because you can just simply override him. So you got to get 2/3. He is stoppable. But it will be how compliant his legislature is always the case. It's what got him out of impeachment, right? So it's the same playbook. But in terms of, at that point, you're not, you've left the sort of trying to win with democratic maneuvering, and you're just straight up taking over the military.
I've noticed that in lots of places, people referring to the possibility of it seems almost like a probability at the moment of our having a cacistocracy instead of a democracy. It seems to me that these people, if they get in, his nominees, if even half of them get in, they're going to make a terrible mess before Congress can get to clean it up. Look at Musk. I mean, there's a lot of things he can do within the law, it seems to me, with the power that he has, with the president behind him, that are just going to be appalling. And I don't understand how we can get it, I understand how we got into this mess, but I don't know how we can get out of it.
Elections. It's going to be elections. It is always going to be elections. That is the only way we can reconfigure the direction that we're going in this country. It's how we've done it for the last 200 plus years, and we'll continue to do it probably for the next 200 plus.
But it seems to me that the whole issue of elections has been getting more and more dangerous for the country in the fact that voting is being suppressed practically everywhere you look. And what can be done? How can we fight that? Because it should be the elections that determine it. I mean,
So voter suppression it's always been with us. The new phase, if you will, is more technically rooted in court cases. Almost none of them have been that successful, honestly. I mean, they've been sort of kind of a lot of waste of time and money for the most part. But that's where they've been arguing, right? And something happened this time around that's sort of strangely good for democracy in this way. If you're looking for a silver lining here, this might be one. He won.
yeah.
And he won pretty clear. And how many times have you heard the word election fraud since then? And I know that that sucks. I really understand that. That stinks that somebody gets to say it's election fraud when I don't win, and then when I do win, I just shut up about it and it's all good. That is the bummer of it all. But in some ways, that diminishes your ability to argue that we're not having fair and free elections going forward.
Excuse me, Craig, it's approaching 9 o'clock and we have to be out of here. But I thank you so very, very much for sharing all
Thank
of
you,
this
guys.
information.
Appreciate it.
We really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
And I want to thank everybody who came out on this rainy night and joined us and contributed so many questions. I really learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a
Thanks.
lot.
Have a good one.